Thank you. Hi. So, first of all, I better start by explaining the title and what's all this about aesthetics and accessibility. So, something that I've heard quite a bit is that accessibility is somehow incompatible with a beautifully designed website, so that you can either have one or the other, but not both. Well, this is actually rubbish because there are plenty of really good looking accessible websites out there to prove it. But what I want to say today is that that doesn't really matter anyway. And this is the part where the aesthetics comes in. So the thing about aesthetics is that there is a lot more to it than beauty. So it's all about sensory and cognitive experience, and that means pretty much any experience can be aesthetically interesting, and that can involve pretty much any one of your senses. So take the example of a hot drink, which is a nice thing on a cold day like today. So you can have several factors here that might be aesthetically interesting. You have the warmth of the mug on your hands. You have the flavor of the contents. You have even the sound that the liquid makes when you're drinking it, and other associations that you might have with other instances when you drank that drink. And all these contribute to possibly pleasing aesthetic experience, and none of these have absolutely anything to do with beauty or even sight. So let's not think too much about beauty, and let's try to think about what can make our experience of the internet aesthetically interesting. So there are at most 3 senses that we can use to access the net: sight, sound and touch, and most of us will use a combination of the 3. Some of us will only use 2 of them or even 1 of them. But those of us who do use all 3, we'll probably tend to think that sight is the most important one because, well, the internet is all about visual stuff and graphics, isn't it? But in truth, if you think that the internet is an interactive experience, and that's sort of the most important thing about it, because otherwise we might as well be reading books, so you can interact with it. And what senses do you actually use when you're interacting with it? Primarily you'll use touch because you have all these mousey and keyboardy things, and you might use sound too. So if you're on a speech-to-text software, you might be talking to the computer, but you never use sight for actual interaction. The only thing you can really do with sight is look at stuff. So if you think about these 3 senses, in reality, sight is maybe the least important of them in what regards a possible aesthetic experience of the internet. Okay, but there are other things that we can think about. In our sort of internet aesthetics, we have to take account of our perception of time. So, when websites take ages to load, it might only be 3 seconds, but it seems like an eternity. And movement, such as scrolling and tabbing through a page. And then there's the flow of things, so how do you get from one point to another, and how the content is structured. And, well, content. You have content, and content is probably the fundamental part of websites, right? So a thing about content, it's a bit funny, I keep hearing that people don't read on the internet. Yeah, but if we're not reading, what else are we doing? So maybe we're watching cat videos. But I think that the thing that people still do most on the net is actually read, even if it is just tweets and status updates and really short stuff. And then writing too, of course, because you have to write your tweets. But these are the primary activities. And okay, maybe we watch a couple of cat videos, but not a lot of them. So it's really all about text. Text is the fundamental thing. Well, actually, not just text, it's hypertext. It's text with links in it. And that's the great thing about the internet. You have text with links. So how can we make this an aesthetically interesting and an accessible experience? Perhaps we should ask, how can we not make this an inaccessible experience? Because text in itself is quite accessible. So we more or less all now know not to do this, but primarily we know that we shouldn't do this because of SEO and not really because of accessibility. So what's wrong with this? It's that we have an image here with a logo, presumably with the company name in it, but it's not machine readable. So your search engine crawler gets to this and says, I don't understand that, and just goes away. So a quick fix for that would be to put an alt tag inside the image. So put the company name there, and then any bot that happens to be passing by will actually be able to read that. And that's a great thing, because machine readable text is something that we can access with all 3 of those internet compatible senses I mentioned earlier. So we can look at it, and we can listen to it if we have a screen reader, but we can also touch it if we have one of these things, which is a Braille display. So that's really awesome. Machine readable text. Well, this is a CSS meetup, so I thought if I was going to talk about accessibility, I'd better talk about stuff that was more or less CSS related. So primarily what I'm going to talk about from this moment is stuff that has to do with the visual presentational part of the net, and so stuff that's primarily interesting for sighted users. But there are quite a few sighted users which have accessibility issues. So one thing that's really important, make your text zoomable, because, well, not everybody can read text at 14 pixels or whatever. So zoom. Browsers are already doing most of the work for us here. And browsers have 2 ways of zooming. So you've got page zoom, where it just, when you go Control plus, and it just zooms up the whole page. And we also have text zoom, and that basically means that you set your browser's default font size to a different size. So that's normally 16, but you can bump it up to 20 or 30 if you can't see very well. Might be good. Okay, so the browsers are doing everything for us. Great. But still, we must think how we can avoid breaking this, because it's actually quite easy to break. So this is a snippet of code from a well-known CSS framework. And what's wrong here? It's that the base font size is being set in pixels. And when you do that, you're actually overriding whatever font size the browser has set. So if your user has set a really large font size, and they browse to your website, they're still going to get those 14 pixels. And that's not too good. So a way around this is to set your base font size in a relative unit, such as percentages. And 100% is always going to be 100% of whatever the browser font size is. And that's up to the user. So that makes things a lot more flexible. But then you have other font sizes that you may need to set. And this is, again, from the same CSS framework. And I mean, what does this even mean? So there's the base font size, which is 14 pixels, and that's being multiplied by 2.6, and somehow that's going to compile to 36 pixels. But it's still in pixels. So we could do this. Might be easier. It's certainly a lot easier to read. Now, I know that this is not exactly the same as the former one, because M's have this thing with cascading, and your M is going to get the font size from the previous element, from its parent element, and it's going to be based on that and not necessarily the root font size. So that might bring some problems. But I mean, really, how many font sizes are you actually using on your website? And unless you're using a bajillion of them, this probably will not happen, especially if your markup is structured properly. So I think it's still quite a usable solution. But anyway, you can use rem, which is a bit more civilized because it's based always on the root font size. Except if you need to support IE8, you can't really, or you'll have to do that and then use a fallback, which will probably be in pixels. So yeah, maybe not great. Hang on. Whoa. Yeah. No? Yes. Awesome. Okay, so second thing about Zoom is it's really important to have a responsive layout. I mean, unless your layout is a single flexible width column, you will probably need to have a responsive layout, because when you zoom in, things become larger in relation to the size of the page, and if it's not responsive, it'll break, or it'll look pretty awful. So, media queries. And one small issue with media queries in Pixels is that they don't always work with all types of zoom. So with page zoom, they'll work on most browsers, for some reason not on Firefox. And with text zoom, they will pretty much not work anywhere. So safer thing to do is to use M once more, because this will make your breakpoints dependent on the actual font size. So it'll always look beautiful with any type of zoom on any browser. But whatever you do, do use media queries, because if you don't, I'll show you a little example. So this is a very well-known repository hosting platform, and it looks quite awesome. They don't seem to be using media queries at all. It looks okay at 0 zoom, but then you bump it up to 5 times on Firefox and it starts to look a bit broken. Anything bigger than that and it's all going to overlap and look awful. But this is not the worst of it, because on Chrome, you only have to zoom it up 3 times and you get that horizontal scroll bar, which should never ever happen anywhere. So, takeaways. Don't use pixels if you can avoid it, and do use responsive layouts. And while you're at it, choose a readable font. And use, I didn't know this was going to work, use adequately contrasting colors, because the light grey on white may look pretty nice and subtle when you're 20-something, but then you come back in 30 years' time and it will look more like that. So please avoid it. Okay, and contrast. So contrast is also really important for something else, which is links. And mainly because nowadays we mostly do this with links when we're styling them. So we don't like that underline, because the underline looks so 90s, right? And it looks sort of amateurish, so we do away with it. But no, that's fine. We can perfectly do that, except we have to think about the contrast between the links and the text, and between the links and the background. And then it all gets complicated, because if you look at an accessibility spec, you need at least 4.5 to 1 contrast between text and background. And then between link and text, you need at least 3 to 1. And if you go for the high spec, for the AAA, then you need 7 to 1 contrast between text and background. And that severely limits the amount of colors that you can use for links to like 3 different shades of blue or something like that. So yeah, you've got to think carefully about what you do with these. And I can show you a positive example this time. And this is a well-known Sydney newspaper, and they're doing the link thing really well, because they are using underline, which is great. But apart from that, they're also using a color which has sufficient contrast to pass the AA level. So that's 4.5 to 1 with the background, and then 3 to 1 with the text. And then on hover, they go nice shade of red, and that's still an acceptable color in terms of contrast. And then on focus, they do something different again. So that's blue with the red underline, and then it's got the default browser outline. But the problem here is, well, I tried tabbing to the actual link on this website, and my focus got caught in a Facebook share button at the top of the page. So I wasn't actually able to tap to it, and I had to go to Browser DevTools and emulate the focus state to get that. So really good links, perhaps slightly faulty keyboard navigation. And that brings us to focus. And focus is at the heart of interaction, so we've got to think about this. Again, how can you break focus? Well, there are many ways, and not all of them involve JavaScript. So this is what we normally do in CSS, because nobody really likes the default outline browser style for focus, and we want to do away with it, but then we often forget to style our own. So non-existent focus means that when you're trying to tab through the links in a website, you don't actually know where you are. And who says links inputs too? So it's a bit of a problem. So, okay, style your own focus if you don't like the browsers. But even if you decide to leave it alone and go with the browser defaults, there are still a couple of things that we should think about here, because these defaults don't always work perfectly. Mainly with links, because the thing with links is that, you know, anchor tags, you can pop anything into them, but then we forget to sort of see what the shape of the anchor tag is as a result. So as an example, I've got this, and this is the anchor tag at the top where the logo is, And the logo is an inline SVG element. Rather nice inline SVG, actually. But still, it's an SVG, it's a block element, and the anchor tag is inline by default. So when you put a block element into it, it goes all funny. And this wouldn't be a problem, except that the right-hand element is also a link. So when you look at this, it's really impossible to know which element is in focus. So we have a usability problem here. It's not just the looks of the thing. And, well, a possible solution would be to grab our anchor tag and change the display to inline block, and then it sort of wraps around neatly. So, yeah, this is definitely something that we should always sort of look at, tab through websites and see if everything is right with the focus. But if you're a perfectionist, then there's other stuff that you can do. Now, let me see if I can grab my demo. Okay, this is it. What's happened? Oh dear. How do I do zoom on this thing? Here am I talking about zoom, it doesn't work. No, I wanted to make it bigger. I'm not used to Macs, sorry. Don't tell me. But I've used this in Chrome? Oh, right. What? Okay, yeah, that's fine. Thank you very much. Well, this is not very accessible. Okay, so focus and outline style. So nobody really likes the default browser outline, and especially because it's inconsistent between several browsers. They all have different styles, so it's really confusing. So one thing you can do is style the outline property, and then you can do pretty much whatever you like, at what thickness and what color and what style you like. But then there's this thing that if you have an element with rounded borders, it never really wraps around correctly. It still has the sharp edges, so it looks a bit bad. And you can do something which is use the outline offset property, and then you can make the outline sort of stand out a bit from the rest. And that's not so bad, but maybe not perfect. And sort of interesting thing about the outline offset is that you can actually set it to a negative value so that it shrinks inside the element. And yeah, I don't know if there are many use cases for this, probably not. It doesn't look brilliant, but anyway. And then you can use border, and that will absolutely respect the border radius, and it will look great, except that you might be wanting to use border for other stuff, especially if you're talking inputs. So there's still another possibility, which is box shadow, and that will do the corners too. And, well, does anybody really use box shadow these days for anything? Maybe, but not too much. Okay, well, text links. Text links are easier because you can do pretty much anything with them. The outline looks okay, and then you can do this trick where you change the background and the foreground, and it's quite visible and it looks fine. Except if you want consistency in your focus styles, you shouldn't really be using this because it only works for text. And then you can use just border with or without radius, whatever you like. Or you can just go wild and mix them all up and do something crazy in pink. That's actually dotted border and box shadow all at once. Okay, so, yeah, back here. How do I put this full screen? All right, so that's focus. And takeaways. So if you want an aesthetically pleasing internet experience, please try to make things accessible and do your text zoomable, your links contrasting, and focus always visible. And that will probably make your users very happy. Thank you.